This is all theater. This is all just political theater.
Political theater. Political theater.
Pure political
Theater.
Theater.
Political theater.
The
nefarious
Significant and protracted
political
theater for political theater's sake.
I yield back.
From Washington, this is Political Theater, Roll Call's review of the spectacle of politics on Capitol Hill and across the country. I'm Jason Dick.
Well, July 26th, 1990 was indeed an historic day. On that day, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law. On that day, America became better because we know an accessible America is a better America.
This week does indeed mark the 31st anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability. The White House marked it on the anniversary itself, July 26th, as you just heard the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, discussing. And we're going to talk about the ADA, its significance, where it may go, how it continues to evolve, with our White House correspondent, Niels Lesniewski. Niels, welcome to Political Theater.
It's always good to be back.
Excellent. It's good to have you back. So on Monday, we did get a White House event in the Rose Garden, a nice sweltering day for everybody. But they wanted to mark the anniversary of the signing of the ADA, and let's talk a little bit about what that event was like, because it wasn't just. It seemed to me it was not just about the law itself, but what the president and his team wanted to say about the law and where they go from here, and also like on a more meta level, that bipartisanship, which the president preaches a lot, works.
Right. The event Monday sort of allowed the president to reflect on legislation that moved through when he was obviously already a longtime senator, and some of his closest friends and allies in the Senate at the time were instrumental in getting the Americans with Disabilities Act into law to begin with. You know, he mentioned during Monday's ceremony folks like the late Senator Ted Kennedy, like Senator Tom Harkin, who was a longtime Democratic senator from Iowa who championed it, and also Republicans like Bob Dole, the longtime Republican leader in the Senate, and the role that they all had in seeing this landmark legislation through to fruition. And that was a lot of what they were sort of talking about, but also what has not yet been done in the field of disability rights and accessibility. Particularly, it seemed the focus on Monday was as it pertains to barriers to the ballot box.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, because I mean, this is one of those just roadblocks that's been thrown up in the Senate in particular. I mean, the Republicans do not want to advance. They don't want to even debate the voting rights legislation that passed the House, or even any kind of versions of it, because they see that it might be just tantamount to a federal takeover of elections. But without any kind of bipartisan thrust on this legislation, it's not going anywhere. And we actually have a clip of Biden talking about how the ADA, wouldn't have happened without bipartisanship, because it was signed by President George H.W. Bush and passed by a Democratic Congress in 1990.
Perhaps most importantly, we did it together. This was a Democratic bill signed by a Republican president, a product of passion and compassion, not partisanship. Progress that wasn't political, but personal to millions of families.
I'm glad you pointed this out, in the story that you wrote earlier in the week for off of the event, that this almost had a couple of dual purposes. It was like, let's talk about, the ADA, let's talk about bipartisanship, and let's also talk about voting rights, because we need Republicans on board in order for voting rights legislation to advance. So where are they putting their attention when it comes to voting rights within, sort of vis-a-vis the ADA?
In this context, it's largely about access to polling places themselves, and certainly making sure that there are options for voting that are easier for folks who may have physical or intellectual disabilities to be able to both, sometimes it's simply a matter of, if you've got a polling machine that someone can't reach because they're in a wheelchair, or there's a case where, sometimes if you have someone with a physical limitation, these hours of standing in line in the hot sun or whatever that you may encounter in parts of the country are not exactly conducive to helping people who may have disabilities. The other thing that I was thinking of was the question of whether or not you're allowed to sort of vote from your car. Mm-hmm. I know this has become an issue, particularly in Texas.
Drive-through voting, right? Right.
Drive-through voting. There are people for whom I suppose it's really much easier. I guess it's much easier for most people, but there are people with particular physical challenges for whom being able to vote from their vehicle curbside is a lot easier than having to go through the entire process of getting into a building in order to be able to vote, especially when, who knows whether or not the building will have a ramp that is appropriately configured and automatic doors. And one of the things that was mentioned on Monday is what happens when there's a broken elevator and the polling station is on the second or third floor of a building. Right.
You would think that in a country where you can buy booze in a drive-up window, you'd be able to vote also. I mean, speaking from experience in my own home state of Arizona, we have drive-up, liquor stores, and we're not alone in that. And yet there are all these barriers that are being erected. And I mean, there is also this strange irony that, like, Texas is the Republican-led legislature and the Republican governor of Texas are sort of leading the charge. They're trying to pass a more sort of restrictive voting access laws in Texas, and the governor himself is somebody who's disabled. He's in a wheelchair himself, and yet it's sort of full steam ahead.
That's certainly one of the things that comes into play here. One of the things that I was thinking about on Monday was the access at the event itself. Frankly, they had done some work to improve the accessibility for the Rose Garden event, but that, as is always the case at the White House, there was any array of wires that people could have tripped over, and there were, certainly I was in the press briefing room immediately or almost immediately after the event, and it was just something that definitely crossed my mind, that it would be really difficult for someone who may have really significant mobility challenges to even access the seating configuration in the White House press briefing room if they were a journalist.
And sort of making this point also about the need for accessibility, even at a place like the White House, you'd think it would be a no-brainer. But we had Jim Langevin, the Democrat from Rhode Island. He's the very first quadriplegic who was elected to Congress, and the House has very I think, somewhat slowly adapted to the fact that they have had this member for several terms now, that there are still accessibility issues getting in and out of the House and the lobby. The doors are very heavy. Like, you don't have a lot of automatic doors. So Langevin is somebody who has been, around for a while, and he was at this White House event, and yet there were still areas where even he could have been, sort of tripped up by you said, like, a bunch of cables, TV cables, wires, that kind of stuff.
It is always a challenge in covering these sorts of events because, and as you say about the Capitol building is probably far worse than the White House even in this regard. I mean, one of the recurring frustrations that I run into operating in and around the Capitol building is the number of doorknobs that I run into. So my my impairment is relatively minor in the grand scheme of things. But I definitely, had a stroke when I was born, and I have had limited mobility on my right side to some extent. And one of the things that is actually really challenging for me, which doesn't rise to the level of being terribly significant, but it's very difficult if I'm holding something in my left hand. I really can't open a door that has a doorknob with my right hand without putting down whatever I was carrying in my left hand. And I run into that in the Capitol building in particular all the time.
And this is also something that is, it became an issue. I mean, it was an issue with ADA compliance because these doors are massively heavy. I mean, they're solid. A lot of them are solid oak, and they're difficult. They're difficult for anybody to open. And now we even have like the added challenge of it seemed like a very, very common sense that we would have like foot openers for a lot of doors, especially in the age of COVID. I mean, this was something that people were like, hey, this just seems to make sense in bathrooms that you never know who's washed their hands. Why not provide us with an option to open doors with our feet? And like even with all this, we're still very far behind the curve in this. And as you said, the Capitol, I mean, granted, the Capitol is a much bigger complex than the White House, but it is kind of one big barrier to accessibility. I wanted to bring up a couple of just facts, that I'd sort of written down. Congress is exempt from a lot of laws, like sort of, for instance, the Freedom of Information Act, as we have found out when we've tried to find information, or when people have said, why can't you just FOIA that? But one of the things that they are supposed to do is adhere to the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Office of Congressional Workplace Rights conducts an audit. They're supposed to conduct an audit every 2 years. To identify barriers and to work with the architect of the Capitol and the various entities who can address these barriers and try to break them down. The most recent audit that has been publicly available is from the 114th Congress. We're in the 117th Congress. In that audit, which was completed years after the 114th Congress concluded in October of 2019, they identified 2,568 barriers in the House and Senate office buildings and in the Capitol itself. They say that they have done an audit recently. They didn't give that much of a timeline. They said it was conducted late last year. Granted, late last year was a crazy time with the pandemic. And the Office of Congressional Workplace Rights says that there are now 1,632 barriers that they've identified, primarily in member offices and in the office buildings. But they haven't made that available. I mean, it's just this to people who think that this is sort of a done deal. Like, we have this law and things take care of themselves. Congress itself, as we can see, is one of the is still not complying.
No, and if you are watching congressional hearings or paying attention to congressional events, one thing I don't know if I won't say I've never seen it, but one thing that's a rather infrequent sight in the Capitol building is a sign language interpreter too, which has become normal practice. If you stream the White House press briefing on the White House website or their YouTube channel, there is a separate box by default with a sign language interpreter, and you know, I don't know. Frankly, I don't know how long it will be before the regular events in the Capitol are all given the same sort of treatment, and I don't expect it to be anytime soon.
That's one thing that in the House they have this select committee on modernizing Congress, and one of their recommendations is that that particularly information that's provided virtually, over when there's a virtual hearing, or the information on a member's website itself, or especially through smartphones, if people are getting it that way, that does take into account that people either need sign interpreters or closed captioning or things like that, or like that, if you're blind and you're trying to access this information, that it needs to be translated to sound, like some of the information. So they are working on it, but like it seems like Congress is always kind of working on these things. I want to also just note that the president, in addition to recognizing the anniversary and making a pitch for bipartisanship and putting some of the spotlight on voting rights, that he made some news too, and we have a clip that we can talk about that a little bit more.
I'm proud to announce a new effort, the first of its kind, to help Americans grappling with long-term effects of COVID-19 that doctors call long COVID. Many Americans who seemingly recover from the virus still face lingering challenges like breathing problems, brain fog, chronic pain, or fatigue. These conditions can sometimes rise to the level of a disability. So we're bringing agencies together to make sure Americans with long COVID who have a disability have access to the rights and resources that are due under the disability law.
Actual news from one of these events too, and this is something that we're just now beginning to understand some of these long-term effects. Long haulers, they're also referred to, people who have long COVID, and that includes some members of Congress too. Like there have been some members who have said that they fear that they are like suffering from some of these effects. Like Tim Kaine had mentioned this recently, that he's like a little concerned about like the long-term effects of having COVID, and that's just one senator.
Yeah, it's no surprise that the long COVID effects, some of which are clearly chronic conditions, would qualify people for some of the accommodations under the ADA and related laws. But it presumably is a good thing that the administration went ahead and made that clear in the event that, once we get past whenever it is, and given the return of masking guidance from the CDC, who knows how long it may be. But, once we get past the immediate sort of national emergency situation, this is something that employers, whether it's the private sector or the government, are going to need to continue to be aware of, because it is another condition that will need to be protected, and employers will need to make reasonable accommodations to folks who end up battling COVID and its related symptoms well beyond the fact of time that most of us are paying any attention to it.
Yeah, it provides a very concrete example of how the ADA kind of evolves, and that like as we get, as our own, life and the way that we live it and the diseases that we're exposed to or things like that, that this law is there to accommodate that, and it provides a very vivid example. Before we wrap up, I wanted to also mention, because the president mentioned Bob Dole in his remarks at the White House, and that reminded the both of us when we were talking about how Dole just turned 98 years old. He is in a wheelchair now, and he has for a long time, he tried to, he was very much a champion of a separate thing. And this doesn't have to do with ADA, but I think it's just sort of relevant and it ties in, which is the UN Disability Treaty, which would guarantee, certain universal human rights, based on disability. This is a treaty that the U.S. has not ratified, and there was this sort of this moment, the sort of an inflection point in 2012 when Dole actually went to the Senate himself to try to lobby his colleagues, and particularly get over the Republican opposition. And let's just talk about what happened back then, because it was just this very dramatic moment and shows you that we still have a ways to go on other things.
Yeah, it was certainly a day that I don't think any one of us who were covering the Senate at that point in time will forget.
It was back in December, early December 2012, yeah.
And because it was clear, as our former colleague Meredith Shiner wrote in the story covering the event that day, that it wasn't Bob Dole's Senate anymore. He couldn't show up and wrangle Republican votes. I think he was 89 years old or so at the time, but he couldn't get it over the threshold, the opposition to sort of the argument that an international treaty would be problematic for the United States was too overwhelming on the Republican side, and it was sort of one of those days where it was one of maybe the earlier signs of how much things had changed from the 90s. And it is something that I think was one of those events where we realized this wasn't the same Senate it used to be. And sometimes I wonder the extent to which the current president is still sort of longing for a time that has in fact passed. And that was certainly a day that it looked like the old Senate of Bob Dole and Joe Biden and Ted Kennedy and the like was no more.
And still, this disability treaty is still not ratified. So a sign that for advocates of disability rights, I mean, these issues do not go away. So, Niels, thanks for talking about this. I mean, it was a lot to unpack. We covered a lot of topics, but when we started talking about doing this podcast, I'm really glad that we were able to do this, because things just so take a life on their own, and the fact that we actually had a Monday event that had both news and ceremony with it, I wanted to make sure that we noted that and came back to it before returning to other topics that can really take up a lot of our time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.